Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Europe, and good evening in Central Asia. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center program here at the Atlantic Council. We have a really good event for you right now. How can Kazakhstan and Central Asia help power and feed the world? And we have a terrific report right here, which has that same title, funnily enough, written by our panelists today. And our panelists are Ariel Cohn, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council with us at the Eurasia Center. We have Margarita Asanova, who's a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. And we have Wesley Hill, who's the International Program Manager for Energy Growth and Security Program at the International Tax and Investment Center. So that's our lineup, and we'll jump right in. But first, let me get my questions. All right, Ariel. This report details how 5 of the Central Asian states can help mitigate the specter of power and food shortages wrought by Moscow's war in Ukraine, and how the West can help Central Asia accomplish this. As you know, Central Asia is in a very tough neighborhood surrounded by difficult powers like Russia and China and Iran. So how does this happen?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting us, and thank you for publishing the report. The Atlantic Council is the leading think tank today on Eurasia.
We like the sound of that.
And in terms of your question, I think if Russia did not invade Ukraine, we would not have this conversation today. What happened is that Russia thought, believing its own propaganda, that it's an energy superpower. And 150 billion cubic meters of gas that they sold in Europe, and millions of tons, millions of barrels a day of oil that they sold in Europe and elsewhere in the world will bring the West, as the Russians said, the collective West, to its knees. It didn't happen. A lot of Russian gas was replaced by gas from Algeria, Nigeria, LNG, Norway, and yes, the United States. Oil is still being sold in the world at great discount. I calculated Russian oil between the Urals brand discount and the war discount is discounted 50%. But the world is looking for sources of replacement of energy resources, of metals, because the world is, for example, in rare earths, which are crucial to our electronics, to our green transformation, and to the military production. Rare earths were dependent 60% for mining on China, 90% on smelting and processing, refining. So where is this all can come from? The answer is, to a great degree, from Central Asia. Kazakhstan is a leading producer of oil, 1.8 million barrels a day and growing. Turkmenistan has huge resources of gas. Kazakhstan produces 2% of the world wheat. Every element on the periodic table is also found in Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan has the largest uranium reserves in the world. So you may ask, so if this wealth is there, why more of it doesn't go to the market? And the answer is landlocked. A lot of transportation arteries go through Russia, historically. This is a legacy of Russian imperialism and colonialism. And lack of investment, or insufficient investment. And yes, the neighborhood political risks, China, Russia, Iran, we used to worry about transnational radical religious extremism, depends on what administration you're quoting, radical Islam. Now, I think that concern is receding somewhat. It didn't disappear. So the question is, what can be done? And the answer is engagement and investment. And I'll leave it at that so that my colleagues can address other questions, and you can return to that question again.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Okay, Margarita, You're an expert on energy and, for that matter, geopolitics in Central Asia and Russia. What are the main issues with the current oil and gas export pipelines in Kazakhstan, and how might those issues be resolved?
Indeed, energy is not just resources. It's relationships, it's geopolitics as well. Kazakhstan oil has been reaching Europe through the Caspian Consortium pipeline going through Russia. But this alternative way, there are alternative ways for Kazakhstan oil to reach Europe, and this is now being developed as a new opportunity. Let me first say that Kazakhstan produces about 84 million tons of oil a year. 64 million tons of this is for export, and this is 80% going through Russia. In the same time, there is some oil going through the Druzhba pipeline. Right now, there is a contract with Germany to deliver Kazakhstan oil through Russia to Germany through Druzhba pipeline, a small amount, about 1.2 million tons this year, and will grow to about 7 million tons next year. But the middle corridor, the corridor from the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan and through Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline and further Baku-Tbilisi-Supsa pipeline to the Black Sea is a very promising route as well for Kazakhstan oil to reach Europe. And this is going to be critically important for the countries in the Balkans and in the Black Sea region. Romania already receives Kazakhstan and Azerbaijani oil. Bulgaria, entirely Russian oil, 100%, and working over capacity at the Lukoil pipeline, Lukoil refinery. This can change dramatically if that oil is replaced with oil from Kazakhstan, but also going up north to Hungary and Slovakia and Czech Republic, which are now still allowed to import Russian oil as an exemption of the sanctions. The other thing I wanted to say is Kazakhstan also supplies about 16% of China's oil. And Tengiz Chevron Corporation is planning to increase oil production. So Kazakhstan oil is going to grow to 90 million tons a year very soon. But energy, in terms of gas, Kazakhstan does not produce as much gas. Central Asia, though, is a very big deposit of natural gas. And here we're going to talk about the Trans-Caspian pipeline later. But Turkmenistan is the fourth largest resource of natural gas in the world, which hasn't been developed and hasn't been sent to European continent yet. They're going mostly to China at the moment and to Russia. But also in terms of energy, we need to talk about nuclear power and the fact that Kazakhstan is the biggest producer of uranium in the world, but does not have enrichment facilities of its own. It has only one that was recently built by China and exports nuclear power routes to China. All the enrichment facilities are in Russia. And what is happening is Kazakhstan uranium is going to Russia, and then it's either returned in terms of a ready product to be used in nuclear power stations, or mostly exported from Russia to Europe, which we know that after the sanctions came into effect is a very difficult route to realize, because European ships are not coming to Russia. Russian ships have trouble coming to Europe. So Kazakhstan needs the middle corridor through the Caspian Sea to be able to export its own nuclear power, nuclear-ready routes to Europe, especially since Europe is developing a lot more nuclear plants now. But this also requires Western investment, potentially European investment, in the enrichment facilities of Kazakhstan so that the country is not dependent on Russia of this critical resource.
Thank you. Wesley, the report clearly sees Astana as best positioned to lead growth in commodity exports from Central Asia. Why, and what steps should Kazakhstan take to take advantage of this?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us on. In terms of how Kazakhstan can take the lead in this matter, thankfully, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Kazakhstan is already in a very good position to take the lead on this. For a very long time, Kazakhstan has been investing in its human capital and its transit infrastructure. Unfortunately, what it needs to do and what Western investors should ultimately seek to do to help this is that this transit infrastructure needs modernizations, it needs more storage capacity, and it needs regular digitalization and financialization updates. So, but the The best part about this is that this does not require a Herculean task. So Kazakhstan has, for a very long time, invested in its human capital. It has the largest percentage of its students going overseas in terms of its investment in education compared to any country in the region. Kazakhstan has also invested to a large degree in diversifying its economy. So that what this will do for its energy exports is that it will not be so domestically reliant on this single heating source or single industry, and this will free up more of its energy for exports. So local initiatives that we've already seen taking off, such as more efficient housing, more efficient transit links, are freeing up large degrees of commodities for export. And thankfully, this is going to help Astana not only in its long-term macroeconomic and geopolitical stability and situation, but also help with its regional leadership.
Okay, thank you. Ariel, the report notes that Western sanctions on Russia strengthen the case for greater commodity exports from Central Asia. That makes them more attractive. Are there additional actions the West could take along these lines to make this happen?
Yes, indeed. First of all, we need to think about Kazakhstan beyond just oil and gas. In oil and gas, as Margarita pointed out, expanding the export routes beyond the pipelines that go to Russia, meaning building up the Trans-Caspian energy bridge that relies on small tankers, some call them barges, to take oil from Kazakhstan to the Absheron Peninsula, loaded in Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, and then ship it to the world markets. Whatever investment that will be needed there may and should come from the West, including things like what the US and the EU members can provide, investment insurance, for example. We should work with Central Asian countries to expand road shows for investment communities, both in London and in New York. We should have the World Bank and other organizations, NGOs and such, work with companies in that part of the world, both on privatization. For example, Astana International Financial Center, that was launched in 2015, is lining up Kazakh companies for IPOs. Some of them already were quite successful, like the Kaspi Bank. It's a cyber bank and financial app, quite advanced and successful IPO. Also work with those companies to clean up its management practices, eradicate corruption, and improve compliance. My colleague, the president of International Tax and Investment Center, Dan Witt, is on the board of Samruk Kazina, bringing Western financial and tax expertise to Kazakhstan. We should keep fossil fuel projects included in multilateral bank portfolio investment. The World Bank and others were taking fossil fuels off the portfolio investment. In the crisis we have now that involves a major energy producer, Russia, and with growing frictions with China, I think we need to consider looking into oil and gas projects as legitimate investment targets. And by the way, the EU recognized natural gas and nuclear as green fuels for energy transition purposes. I'll probably stop here.
Okay, thank you. Margarita, can you walk us through how these shifts in energy supply chain would work? Take the middle corridor, for example. What would it take to get the proposed Trans-Caspian pipeline up and running?
The middle corridor is going to be very important, especially for Eastern Europe, in terms of gas supplies. We see how important the Southern Gas Corridor now is for the Balkans. starting to deliver gas to some of the countries there and diversifying gas supplies together with the United States and other LNG suppliers to the region. But this can be expanded by Turkmenistani gas. And this is why the Southern Gas Corridor was built with very large capacity, so that it can absorb Turkmen gas when it comes online. Whether the Trans-Caspian pipeline is going to be built or not, it's still up in the air, and it depends on several factors. One, and the most important, is Turkmenistan, and what Turkmenistan is going to do in order for this to happen. Turkmenistan is out of money. It is in a financial crisis, an economic crisis as well. So it needs to export gas to the West. It's much more lucrative gas price, much easier to sell now to Europe when gas is in shortage. And it's going to continue to be one of the major fuels for the next 30 years. The transition period and even post-transition period, it's going to be important fuel for the European economy. The other part is that the legal ground for building the Trans-Caspian pipeline is now in place after the agreement that was achieved on the Caspian Sea. Only two countries that are connected, Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, need to give their consent for building a pipeline on the bottom of the Caspian Sea, while the waters are still divided between the littoral countries according to international convention about the seas, which means 12 miles offshore belongs to the country and the rest is shared. The bottom of the Caspian Sea is divided into the five countries, and that makes Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan neighbors. So what they're doing now, they're building this interconnector between their offshore deposits on the territory of the Caspian Sea of Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, which is only about 50 miles, very short link. This can be easily done, and that is going to provide Turkmenistan gas to the Southern Gas Corridor. The other thing is very important to say that Turkmenistan is also ready with the infrastructure. It's not only the Southern Gas Corridor that's ready on the eastern shore, on the western shore of the Caspian Sea, but the Turkmenistani network, the East-West pipeline, which is 780 kilometers natural gas pipeline, is in place, and it can provide a lot of gas ready to be exported to Europe. So we're talking here about Europe. There are other avenues. Turkmenistan pretty much had a very bad experience with China, which invested a lot in Turkmenistani gas, but the returns are very small because that's what China does. It finances pipelines, and then the payment of interest rate is very high, so little profit is left for Turkmenistan. And as much as they're trying to expand and export more gas to China, this is not going to solve the country's financial problems. But gas is important. It's critically important, as I said, mostly for Eastern Europe. And the fact is, the United States last year replaced half of the gas, the natural gas previously delivered by Russia to the European continent, half. It was a kind of an easy thing to do. It seems now the prices were good, of course. They were conducive for American companies to go and supply LNG, but that might not be the case next year. The prices might be more normal. So is American companies going to be incentivized to deliver gas to Europe, or that gas is going to go somewhere else where the price is traditionally higher, like Asia? So this is why resources of gas from the Caspian region are critically important for Europe.
If I could just follow up, Margarita, on this. The obvious thing for Turkmenistan is to export gas to the West. Moscow has blocked that via its pipelines. And of course, for years, Iran and Russia worked against any agreement on the Caspian Sea that would permit this. Are you confident that that issue is put to rest and a pipeline can now be built?
There's so many factors that are going to play into the eventual realization of the Trans-Caspian pipeline. And yes, of course, Russia and Iran are two of them. But look what is happening in Russia and look what is happening in Iran. Both countries have domestic, economic, and other problems. Russia is becoming weaker by the day. I think the day is going to come when Russia might not be the obstacle that it used to be. Besides, we have a legal agreement on Caspian Sea now that is a little difficult to overcome from legal perspective.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's see now. Wesley, the report recommends that Central Asian states increase regional cooperation to mitigate the danger of divide and conquer strategies from its neighbors. What does regional cooperation look like in the context of energy and food commodity exports?
So the biggest thing that these countries can do to increase regional integration is that they need more day-to-day economic activity with each other. So for a very long time, Central Asian states, their export-oriented markets were fully focused on the West or Russia or China. There was barely a trickle of goods, a normal economic activity across big borders and markets. So as a result, these countries were often competing against each other for distant markets, and they were not fully realizing local markets, and they're not fully utilizing even their own markets. So if there was more local cooperation on just the most basic infrastructural issues, we would see more cooperation and more realization of energy-related export goals. So for example, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan have not been able to reach export agreements that would help them solve the Caspian Sea issues that Margarita mentioned earlier. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan have often quarreled over infrastructure that would go east towards China. And this has resulted in actually China being able to sort of divide and conquer its opposition and extract better deals for itself. Uzbekistan has obviously, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have had endemic border problems, and as a result, that their infrastructural capacity and their export capacity, limited as it may be, is further hampered because now there are certain routes out of the countries geographically that they cannot utilize or export or utilize at all. For Kazakhstan, the absolute best thing that they could do is that they could lean in to existing mechanisms to increase regional cooperation that would help solve some of these local issues. So for example, the C5+1 mechanism, the Central Asian 5 countries plus the United States, this already exists. They already have ministerial level meetings. There's already attempts to coordinate policy. We can lean into this mechanism, and investors and stakeholders in the West can also take more notice of what this mechanism is doing, because unfortunately there is a lack of Western financial interest in what this mechanism itself is doing, even if there is significant interest in the region.
I'm going to liven things up a little bit by throwing you a curveball.
Okay.
It'll be a curveball for all the panelists. My impression, and you're welcome to disagree, is that the C5+1 is a brilliant idea which has been pursued with insufficient energy, and a lot more could come of it. Your thoughts?
I think I would largely agree. I think that it's a step in the right direction. I think that this can serve as the foundation of something that really increases regional integration, helps all of these countries economically, politically, socially, but it has not realized its full potential. Some of the reasons why it hasn't realized its full potential is Russian interference, Chinese interference, for example, with China. They recently announced that in Xi'an on May 18th and 19th, they were going to have a meeting with the C5 countries and then China. So China wants to create its own C5+1. So the United States, for our part, we are strategically undervaluing this region between China and Russia, and it's in a rough geopolitical neighborhood. So the United States and Western stakeholders need to actually help the C5+1 realize its easily attainable goals.
Ariel, your thoughts too, and then we'll come to you, Margarita.
Well, I'm, for my sins, I'm following the region for about 30 years and traveling there. And I must say the U.S., to a large degree the EU, have a tunnel vision when it comes to Central Asia. So whatever is the burning question of the day gets addressed, like when we had a problem in Afghanistan, everything was about Afghanistan. Before that, everything was about oil, and then EU sort of disappeared from the radar for a long time. Based on my conversations in the region and understanding how the folks there think, I believe that we need to think about broad and comprehensive engagement that includes all tools in our policy toolbox, including economic, including education, including health, including security, and including investment. And for that, we are the superpower. We need to be able to walk and chew gum.
Thank you.
Okay? I'm not done.
Oh, sorry.
You just get me started. So, for example, C5+1, I think it was started under Secretary Kerry. Correct. But it didn't expand. It doesn't include, there's no C5+1 defense ministers meeting, C5+1 energy ministers meeting, etc. This is also a time for us to think, to end the Jackson-Vanik amendment from 1974 that still lists Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. For what? I am a Jackson-Vanik baby. My family left the Soviet Union in 1976. I'm a bit older now. So the comprehensive approach, there was a period when I think this administration didn't even have a strategy vis-a-vis Central Asia. 2018 strategy was written, led by Lisa Curtis, who's going to, by the way, speaking at an event that I'm moderating and Wes is moderating at the Wilson Center on Tuesday, 10 a.m. You're all welcome. 2 panels and lunch. But not having a Central Asia strategy and just mentioning it in passing is not how superpowers behave about vital regions of the world.
Thank you. Margarita.
I would like to add something else to that. I completely agree that the region is undervalued by both the Europeans and the Americans. And here we need a strategy to realize it's between Russia and China. It is influenced by both of them. It's landlocked, and it's strategically important when you have one power that is attacking European security order, world security order, and another power that is considered a rival to the United States and expanding. But there is something else that's going on, and it is to a large extent as a result of the war in Ukraine. The self-promoted, the self-made integration of Central Asia. There was far-reaching agreements achieved by the 5 countries last summer that are going beyond anything that we have ever expected from Central Asian states. It seems that the rivalries are going to be subsided somehow. It seems that cooperation is first order of business, and we see that cooperation also expanding to other countries in the region, with Azerbaijan in particular and Turkey. And it's not only about energy, because the oil that goes from Kazakhstan to Azerbaijan for now is small quantities, and it might be more expensive because it involves tankers and a lot of investment. But this is cooperation in other areas too. Look at what's happening with fertilizers. When we talk about energy, we talk about gas and oil. But gas is needed for fertilizers production as well. This is the raw material for fertilizers. And both Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are expanding and building new facilities for fertilizers. If they can't export their gas, they're going to export it in the form of fertilizers. And given the shortages in the world after the war began in 2022, I mean, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, given the fact that Ukraine used to provide 50% of the grains for the World Food Organization, and Russia and Ukraine together were producing about 40% of the food and grains and oils from sunflower in the world. This is very important to provide the world with seeds and with fertilizers. Azerbaijan has built an entire terminal to import and to export Central Asian fertilizers. This is something that it's not much known, it's not much in the discussion, but the developments are really significant in terms of regional cooperation and regional integration. And we need to support that. The American administration absolutely needs to support that and help in any way possible, because the region is finally ready to be put on the map as a region and be considered as a region, both economically and geopolitically. And that's a process that took more than 30 years in the making, but it's coming, and it needs all the supports that they can get.
Thank you. Okay, now back to our regularly scheduled program. So, Ariel, how would you assess U.S. engagement? Actually, you partly answered that in that last sequence, but how would you assess U.S. engagement in Central Asia today? And what do you think are the realistic near-term goals for increasing Washington's engagement in the region?
Well, let me repeat that I think, and this was my position all along, even when relations with Russia were better, this was my position in Russia, because Russia was under Jackson-Vanik till about 2012, until Magnitsky. And I was saying, there's no objective reason to maintain a really obsolete measure if the country is behaving properly. In the Russian case, it was aggression, it was corruption, it was killing of people who exposed corruption. The justified, after Jackson-Vanik was lifted, was justified Magnitsky. In case of Central Asia, if we want to boost the region, the intra-regional cooperation, and boost exports of vital raw materials, including uranium, including oil and gas, wheat, fertilizer, also encourage renewables in the region. Uzbekistan received billions of dollars of Middle Eastern investment, Saudi, UAE, et cetera, for solar. Uzbekistan is Saudi Arabia of solar. A lot of 300 and something days out of 365 of full solar exposure, very low prices per kilowatt for solar in Uzbekistan. So if you do that, get rid of old punitive measures. When we monitor sanction compliance, we should monitor sanction compliance, but don't say, generalized accusations. Don't beat them over the head if they don't violate sanctions and say, oh, just, Central Asian countries are violating sanctions. Be careful about that. Engage younger people. Your next question is going to be about the attitudes. I'll be happy to talk about engage younger people in terms of education, in terms of culture. In my experience, more educated, urbanized, younger Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and others are not necessarily looking to study business management in Moscow or international relations in Beijing, with all due respect to Tsingtao University. So engage them, educate them, build bridges, build relationships, and take it from there.
Okay, thank you. The report also talks about TAPI, which is the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. And it recommends proceeding with this. Margarita, what do you think about that? What would the U.S. gain if we were to move forward on this?
The United States was very interested in TAPI while we were still in Afghanistan. I don't see this interest continuing right now, but for sure it's going to benefit security and stability in the region, and in that respect, the United States has interest to build TAPI. So Turkmenistan is eager to move forward with the project, and Pakistan is also willing to implement it, even if India withdraws from that project. And that's a significant development of lately that is showing the interest of Pakistan to get Turkmenistan natural gas from Turkmenistan. But of course, Afghanistan's security concerns and political situation also remain a concern in Afghanistan, and this is a challenge to TAPI. So some security issues can be addressed if there are favorable factors created, including increasing the stakes of the Afghans, pointing out the transit revenues from the pipeline would make up around 80 to 85% of Afghanistan's annual budget, making it crucial for them to ensure its security. So there are factors that could be an incentive to Afghanistan, but the TAPI is still up in the air. I have no prediction about that.
Thank you. Errol, you wanted to jump in on this?
Yeah, in 2006, Lisa Curtis, who was then my colleague at the Heritage Foundation, and myself wrote a paper about TAPI because we wanted to sink the Iran-India gas pipeline. And since then, as you know, TAPI got some funding for feasibility study from Asian Development Bank. It's a pipeline that would go from Turkmenistan to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and at that time there was talk about India. And as one of these things like fusion, you know, we're always 10 years away from workable fusion. I hope it's changing. I hope we will have fusion soon. I hope we'll have TAPI soon. But as Margarita pointed out, it's down to Afghanistan security management. In 1996, a delegation before the collapse of, 1996, when Taliban came to power the first time, a delegation of the Taliban flew to Los Angeles to talk with Occidental Petroleum about a pipeline in Afghanistan. The first thing the delegation wanted to do is to go visit Disney World, or Disneyland. What is a Disneyland, right? They may have gotten their trip to Disneyland, but they didn't get the pipeline. If the Taliban government figures out where the pipeline goes and hires the local tribes to guard it, then we may have a secure pipeline that brings gas to Pakistan. If they steal gas, drill holes in the pipeline and steal gas, and the gas can flame, it's highly flammable, then we won't have the pipeline. Pakistan, as you probably know, is in dire straits, lacking electricity and having energy crises. A pipeline like that for Pakistan would be a lifesaver. It's up to their Afghan friends. And the relationship, by the way, the relationship between Kabul and Islamabad is not good at all.
Thank you.
Just
Yeah,
another
please,
actually point to bring up regarding TAPI is that China is also intimately involved in this project because China currently consumes most of Turkmenistan's energy exports. So TAPI is only going to happen if there is Chinese approval or Chinese incentive for this to happen. There's several ways that this could come to fruition. It's not an impassable obstacle. If China sees that allowing more Turkmen exports would enable some sort of competition against Russia in the region. So for example, because Russia and Gazprom have been working closely with Turkmenistan for many years, and there are Gazprom facilities inside Turkmenistan, and there are talks between Gazprom and Turkmenistan for energy exports to go north. If China sees that it's not in its interest, then, but not able to absorb all of Turkmenistan's energy supplies, then TAPI may come to fruition, at least on the Turkmen side. So China is also another key veto player that we need to consider when talking about the feasibility of TAPI.
Thank you. So, Margaret, another question for you. Russia obviously still has major influence and powers of coercion for Central Asia. If the countries of Central Asia will begin to implement the recommendations of this report, how do you think Russia would react?
Well, I would say that for the first time, Russia has more interest in Kazakhstan and in Central Asia than Kazakhstan has interest in Russia. It's very interesting. Kazakhstan continues to trade with Russia, but the main trade partner of Kazakhstan is China. At the same time, Russia needs new pipelines to export its oil and gas to Asia, and Kazakhstan is a vital transit route for that. So if Russia continues stopping the CPC pipeline, suspending it and obstructing transit of Kazakh oil to the Black Sea, to Novorossiysk, then you have the reverse situation. You have Russia depending on Kazakhstan to allow or not to allow oil and gas going through its territory to Asia. So I think the relationship has changed. The war has changed that relationship. And Kazakhstan is becoming bolder in refusing to accept the annexation of Ukrainian territories, being vocal about it on the part of President Tokayev, and being vocal about obstacles that Russia creates for transit of oil through the CPC pipeline. I think the relationship between China and Russia will continue. There's absolutely no doubt about it. It's not possible not to continue in economic terms, but it's going to be much more guarded relationship in terms of Kazakhstan being careful about having alternative options for export of energy and goods as well, and securing some leverage over Russia through this, and using the need for Russian transit, energy transit, and the need for Russia to receive goods through Kazakhstan from China, because the economy is so strangled right now and doesn't have access to Western goods at all. So they're coming from Asia mostly. So Kazakhstan is becoming extremely important to Russia, and that is going to preserve some kind of stability and peace in the region. But at the same time, Kazakhstan announced that they're planning to expand their military and defense sector. So there are two sides of the story.
Thank you. Okay, Wesley, the whole concept of the Middle Corridor to get products from Central Asia out across the Caspian, through the Caucasus, Turkey. How do the Caucasus countries and Turkey look at this?
Well, they're very enthusiastic about the entire project. So as mentioned earlier by my colleague Margarita, Azerbaijan has already invested a lot in receiving facilities. So whether it's for fertilizers, agricultural equipment, and also in petroleum products. So Azerbaijan, as a terminus of Central Asian exports going on elsewhere, is pretty well equipped to absorb a lot of excess capacity very quickly. The logistical bottleneck is actually from the Central Asian side in that regard. Beyond Azerbaijan, which is pretty universally enthusiastic about the project, Georgia is also enthusiastic. There's a lot of existing pipeline infrastructure that goes through Georgia for export at Batumi, which goes out elsewhere via the Black Sea, and overland through to Turkey. Really the lone dissenter in sort of the project would be Armenia, but Armenia is not really in a great position to object. The Nagorno-Karabakh issue has not gone in its favor, and also there is controversy over Russian troops maintaining the external borders control in Armenia. So in terms of transit in the South Caucasus, there shouldn't really be significant problems, but there will need to be further investment in infrastructure and just financial planning, but there aren't significant geopolitical constraints.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Had bronchitis.
Has Moscow's big invasion of Ukraine changed attitudes in Central Asia towards cooperation with the U.S., the EU, Japan?
One thing people learn being in a region surrounded by great imperial powers, Russia, China, and looking at the example of theocratic dictatorship in Iran, is that they want to keep their options open. They do not want to go back to a colonial model that they were in some cases from second half of the 18th century in Kazakhstan, second half of the 19th century in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, etc., Russian conquest, and before that, the historic memory of Chinese presence, domination, or Chinese sending other tribes like the Dungan into Central Asia to slaughter the Kazakh, those memories are there. What does it mean? It means that those folks who watch Russian television that is still broadcast in those parts, some of them buy the Russian position, but the elites do not buy the Russian position. The elites very clearly, and probably most clearly in case of Kazakhstan, when President Tokayev said on the record, we do not recognize the Crimean annexation and the 4 oblasts, the 2 Donbass and the 2 other oblasts in Ukraine that Russia declared annexed and doesn't control fully Zaporizhia and Kherson. When they say Tokayev and the vice ministerial level and administration senior officials say we're not going to expose ourselves to sanctions violations. So I think Kazakhstan is clearly on the record. Uzbekistan pretty much in the same boat. And even President Rahmon, in his own inimitable way, got in Putin's face and said, stop treating us the way you treat us. So I think the process of decolonization in Central Asia is still continuing. Those countries that switched quickly to the Latin alphabet, put a marker there, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan. Others are going slow about the transition from Cyrillic to Latin, but it's happening also in Kazakhstan. And in my travel there, I think the split is very important. It's the split between the younger, more educated, economically active elite that would rather go to Harvard Business School or London Business School or INSEAD in France to study business or study law. And those folks who would be still, I don't know if today it's still happening, but until the reinvasion of Ukraine in 22, a lot of younger people would be sent to Moscow or to Beijing to study in military academies, security academies, and police academies. And that is dangerous because it engenders a split in the elites in the world outlook, and also, as they say, the ties that bind, and I don't mean the ties we wear. So in that respect, more engagement by our military war colleges, by our security studies programs would be advisable in Central Asia.
You want to jump in on this, Margarita?
About the question of whether the attitudes changed?
Yes.
Yes, I think the attitudes changed tremendously. There's been always, the Kazakhs have been always wary of Russian presence at their border. It's a very long border, the longest border between two states in the world. And of their very large ethnic Russian minority, we have 3.5 million Russians, which is 17% of the population. Although much smaller than it used to be in the 90s and even early 2000s, but still the Russian minority is very significant. Anytime you have an ethnic minority that's over 10%, you need to have different provisions in a society politically in order to be able to preserve the peace. It's not just the normal human rights you need, collective rights, you need a lot of provisions. Kazakhstan has been very successful in that, but the war challenged a lot of attitudes, and a lot of people are very unhappy with what is happening in Ukraine and what they see Russia is doing in Ukraine. Most people, we went for election monitoring there a couple of times in November, in March. Most people were saying that all they want is peace and security. That was their main driver. They were really worried about the war. They're worried about the instability in the region. And they were hoping for leadership that is going to support development of Kazakhstan as sovereign, independent state that is not going to be put under Russian thumb or threatened with invasion by Russia.
As the Russian politicians did.
Yes. Yes, Russian politicians have threatened Kazakhstan several times, including the ambassador of Russia to Astana, who openly said we can help here with curbing Kazakh nationalism, as if nationalism is a bad thing when you have a process of decolonization. No, it's not. It's forming a national identity that is extremely important. And Kazakhstan is becoming more Kazakh every year. So we can see the growing of the Kazakh as a population, the higher birth rates, much lower death rates, the longer expectation of life among the Kazakhs compared to Russians and other Ukrainians, for example, in Kazakhstan. But Kazakhstan is becoming more Kazakh, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the same way as most of the countries that broke away from the Soviet bloc developed national identities that are separate from the Soviet identity, separate from this imposed Warsaw Pact of socialist identity as well. And that was a process of generation of countries' economies, of countries' societal development. Yes, there is a lot of drive now, and among the people as well, to cooperate closer with the United States and the European Union, with Japan, with India. The drive is really strong. The political elites are also pursuing such policy. Despite the fact that Kazakhstan always had multi-vector foreign policy. This is not something new that Kazakhstan is developing now, but now it's much more needed. Because the balance between Russia and China in Kazakhstan has to be maintained. And the only way to not to allow the ground of competition and cooperation between Russia and China in Central Asia is to have solid, robust involvement by the West.
Thank you. We have lots of questions from a very inquisitive anonymous attendee, but I'll start with the people who identified themselves. We have a question from O.D. Mayer, who wants to talk about sanctions. He talks about there's concern in the West that sanctions are being avoided in Central Asia, sanctions on Russia being avoided in Central Asia. Comments on this?
Okay, I'll take it. So, well, I mean, Kazakhstan is always going to have, and all of Central Asia is always going to have some sort of economic activity with Russia. I mean, it is the longest border anywhere in the world. So there's always going to be some economic activity, and the presence of this economic activity is going to make identifying sanctions compliance and sanctions breaches harder. But it's pretty clear from an overwhelming majority of economic data that there is no systematic violation of sanctions in Kazakhstan and the rest of Central Asia. They have every incentive and every reason to remain compliant with sanctions, and they have very little incentive to break these sanctions. I'm sure that there's like some smugglers in the night crossing the border, hauling electronics or something like that. But this is, minuscule and statistically really not important.
One of the biggest concerns of Astana has been to avoid secondary sanctions. Because if they violate sanctions, there are going to be Western sanctions against Kazakhstan, against Uzbekistan, against any country in Central Asia. And that is going to be extremely detrimental to the economic development, especially if both countries, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan in particular, are going through robust plans for robust economic reforms, whether and how these plans are going to be realized, but they are announced, they are there, and if they want to achieve it, secondary sanctions is not going to help. So they are making sure, they dismantled the Sberbank, all the offices of Sberbank. They closed the bank, and the bank was bought by the state. That hasn't happened even in some countries in Europe, in the Balkans, for example. And this is significant. So this is how the government is showing a really significant effort to avoid breaching sanctions and hurting their own economy because of Russia's aggression in Ukraine.
Al, you want to jump in? We have other questions.
Well, I would just like to point out that Kazakhstan has a track record of helping people who run from man-made disasters. In World War II, millions of people were refugees in Kazakhstan, and now hundreds of thousands of Russians who didn't want to fight in Ukraine came to Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan opened the doors and let them in. Some of them returned to Russia, some of them relocated elsewhere. But I think the credit is where credit is due. Kazakhstan was very hospitable to the war refugees, in this case from Russia, who did not want to be a part of Putin's cannon fodder in Ukraine.
Thank you. Okay. Another question, this one from Thomas Baker. Even if we can argue that the core legal capacity, infrastructure, and customs integration issues of the Trans-Caspian route can be solved, is it not likely that Turkmenistan's poor business environment will sink investor interest in unlocking this trade potential?
On gas, no, because it's centralized, it's high level, and Turkmenistan had gas exporting machinery to Russia. Then Russia stopped it in a pretty brutal way by blowing up a compressor station in 2009, I think. Turkmenistan was capable of building a successful gas exporting operation with China. There's no reason for me to believe that they will not be able to do the same to Azerbaijan and further west. By the way, Azerbaijan, the recent visit of President Aliyev to Kazakhstan, they're talking about an alliance and a strategic partnership. So that too is an important development.
Thank you. Okay, we have a tough question from Jeff Bell at the National Endowment for Democracy. Commodities exports in Central Asia are infamous for their human rights concerns. In Kazakhstan last year, in January of 2022, those events were sparked by oil and gas workers upset with the cost of living. We focus on the violence in Almaty, but these workers, who are not allowed to form independent unions, essentially controlled Mangistau Oblast for close to a week. How can we mitigate the structural risk? Margarita.
Very good question. And let me explain something that I don't think that many in the West understood. Why the events in Kazakhstan happened in January 2022. We had two phases of this unrest, if we can call it. It was unrest, certainly. One was the phase of those trade unions who organized very peaceful protests in Aktau and Atirau and other parts of the western part in Kazakhstan that went calmly and smoothly, like the mood was like celebration with the national anthem and so on. And you have protests in other places that were hijacked, that were captured by certain interest groups. Whether this was a power struggle, whether these were groups that were trying to bring Kazakhstan in another place politically, but this was not due to the legitimate protests of the people against the increase of gas prices. And the legitimate organization done in the western part of Kazakhstan by trade unions. By the way, there is a range of strikes by trade unions right now in Kazakhstan that are being worked out and they're being negotiated. And they have been since 2011, since the Zhanozan events. I don't think that the trade unions are suppressed. I think that they're growing, and they will be growing. The trade unions played incredibly important role for the economic transitions of Eastern Europe, starting from Poland, but also going to other countries as well. And they are organizations that are going to be critical for the transition of Kazakhstan to more a social economy, or economy that has distribution of goods, of benefits to the people. So there is a whole party that is based on trade unionism that ran for presidential candidate last year in November, and they did not run for the parliamentary elections, but they are a factor, and they will continue being a factor in Kazakh politics. I think the time of egregious human rights abuses, especially after the events in January, when a lot of people were killed in these clashes, people that had nothing to do with organizing the protests as well, really have taught everyone a lesson. And I think that we are going to see a different stage. Just like in Uzbekistan after Zhanozan, and seeing the Zhanozan event, the Andijan events from perspective of what caused them, there is a reflection also what caused Zhanozan and what caused the events in Almaty and several other places with violence. And there is, I can tell you, watching all these events from all perspectives, there are so many factors that were involved. Whether this is, in some cases, insurgency, in other cases is a power struggle. In other cases, you have involvement of political actors who would like to benefit from the events. There are always other factors, but not just the trade unions and just the people organizing a peaceful protest. But Kazakhstan has a long way to go in terms of political reforms and allowing a true different opposition groups to also compete in elections. And I'm sure we're going to see that. We have a six-party parliament now. It's still dominated by the ruling party, Amanat, but I'm sure that this gradually would start changing. Of course, the government is concerned about instability in the midst of war in Ukraine and in the midst of instability that is threatening the region and the upheavals of the global economy, but that's not a reason to suppress genuine political groups.
And Amanat getting 53 or 54% in parliamentary was actually a surprise to me.
Okay, we've got 1 minute left and many questions. Ariel, Chief, you can answer this in 45 seconds. Greg Rushford compliments us for a very informative seminar. And he says, can you elaborate on the tools that Moscow might think of using to preserve Kazakhstan's current dependency upon Russia?
Well, my big concern is, especially having listened to many statements by Russian politicians that the northern and western parts of Kazakhstan were gifted to Kazakhs by the Russian Empire. Bogus accusations of nationalism, comparing Kazakh nationalism with quote-unquote fascism in Ukraine. We've seen that playbook. This is using co-ethnics to destabilize. And just as they were closing down the strategic pipeline, the CTC pipeline that controls 80% of Kazakh oil exports, they can shake the cage, if you want, of Kazakhstan by threatening ethnic unrest. Russian television that I mentioned before is also a strong tool of Russian propaganda. All that are the negative tools, and Kazakhstan, as colleagues pointed out, also is dependent on a lot of trade, whereas other countries are depending on their people working in Russia and sending money back to Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. So Russia has the toolbox, and will not hesitate to use it.
Well, we're 1 minute over. We'll have to call it quits here. Thank you for a great report, which again, right here, and a great panel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.